My name is Dario Hasenstab. I'm here with Balder Hagratz, and we are back with the Western Bubble podcast. Today, we're talking about a few topics because we're living in very exciting times. The US election is coming up. The Tories in the UK just voted for a new leader, and the media is also playing an important role in all of this. Balder, how are you doing? Just 2 days before the US election. Are you excited? Are you watching all the content, looking at all the different polls? What's happening with you in these times?
Hi, Dario. I'm afraid that my experience here is one of noticing my age because every time there are new elections, I start caring less. I deeply remember my enthusiasm in the late 90s, and especially the high point of my political enthusiasm was 2008, the Obama elections, when we thought that a new era was about to unfold for the world. But since then, since the disappointment of the Obama administration and the nonsense of the Trump administration and then Biden, I stopped caring, I must say. And not obviously it has an important impact on the world. Obviously, this is an important topic, but I really have to force myself to read the news about it.
I mean, also this year it's particularly bad, right, from all sides. I mean, you hear, I mean, scandals that almost aren't scandals anymore because of how numb we have become to behavior on all sides of the spectrum, but obviously particularly with Donald Trump. And it's for me with the last election it started a little bit earlier. With this election, I mean, 2 days before, I basically started really reading into it yesterday in preparation for today's episode.
But you also mentioned briefly before the episode that you're actually expecting the next couple of days to really delve into it. What is it that makes you so, in that sense, excited about it? Why are you actually going to follow it closely?
Chaos. I absolutely love chaos. I mean, it was an episode we recorded 1 year ago, when nothing was happening in the news. I don't know if you remember with this. And in Berlin, they thought there was a lioness that broke loose. And for 3 days, everyone here in Berlin was a little bit worried. Like, oh, am I going to bump into a lioness next in the next moments? And that's also when I jumped into all of the coverage. Right, I was like, okay, let me go on Twitter. Are people taking pictures of her? Are they finding her? Are people making fun of the situation by playing lion sounds? There's a zookeeper being interviewed on what to do when you encounter a lioness. For me, it's very much this kind of everyone looking at the same thing, and also the pop culture references that are being born out of it. The fact that everyone is talking about it. It's kind of maybe it's a little bit the bonfire of our forefathers, right? So that everyone is looking at the same thing right now. Everyone is talking about it. And then there's just something is happening, something is in the air. Everyone is a little bit, on edge.
Yeah, maybe this is also the difference between someone who already has a child and someone who doesn't, because I think I was a bit like that, like enjoying the chaos of international relations as almost entertainment sometimes. But nowadays, I can't view it in any way as something entertaining. I find it incredibly difficult and frustrating to watch, knowing that it leads to actual human suffering and knowing that it actually leads to a worse future, right? The current political climate in the United States, but ever increasingly so in Europe as well, is one that is just so inherently destructive. And I associate my son's future with that. And I don't want my son to grow up in a society where the political system has completely collapsed. And so I don't I it's sort of that's why I have to force myself to read about it and to watch it because it's part of my job, because it is kind of painful to do so.
I think there's also a certain disconnect on my end, because we're talking about the United States, we're not talking about Germany. If this was a German election, I think I would probably behave differently. I mean, also because I work in the German political scene. So there, I'm also a lot more affected myself. I mean, now friends and family are affected by it, right? Living in the United States in different states, and yeah, I can't really pin it down, but there's just something about it for me of kind of taking the next few days and just kind of really I don't know, learning about a county in Georgia and how many people have voted for Trump there versus in the other one. All right, there's something very exciting about this. Also, obviously, because of how the United States, right, U.S. media kind of reports about this, they basically treat it as a sports game.
Yeah, it is incredibly, the way the system is set up is incredibly entertaining systemically, right? It is something that other countries don't do as well, making the elections into something to get the popcorn out, basically. Oh, when will we know the results from Florida? When will we know the results from Pennsylvania? That kind of structure is something that makes for a very exciting night. It just feels to me that the stakes are ever higher, and therefore I don't want it to be entertaining anymore. I just want it to lead to good, positive outcomes, and that seems ever less likely.
I feel like that's a sentence that we say about every election, right? The stakes are as high as ever, which I don't know if that's us kind of ignoring the past or whether things are actually just getting worse and the stakes are higher.
Well, so that's actually interesting because you're right, but I think typically that's being said in a slightly different context than what I meant. Because it is, of course, nonsense to believe that every election the choice is fundamental, and I don't think I don't have much reason to believe that this election is, for example, more important in terms of the options available than, let's say, the elections of 2000, where if Al Gore had won, the reaction to 9/11 would have been completely different than the George W. Bush reaction to 9/11, and probably the war in Iraq had never happened and things like that. So this idea that, oh, this is the most important election of a generation and this is absolutely crucial is typically a bit of nonsense. And I certainly think that in 2024 that's a bit of nonsense. When I say the stakes are ever higher is because the system overall is more fragile. So it's not so much about voting for Trump or voting for Harris, but the system is just increasingly fragile, increasingly in danger of collapsing. And that makes it so painful to watch, which is a slightly different emphasis.
It's a bit ironic almost that you brought up the election of the early 2000s, because that's the example I always use to say, just imagine we would be in a situation such as the one in the early 2000s, right, where the votes had to be recounted, it almost went to the courts, and so on and so forth. Just imagine that taking place today with the current political environment, with talks of election fraud and cheating and trying to undermine the system are happening before the election has even taken place, right? So just, in case we lose, let's already undermine the election. If we win, well, then everything must have been fine.
Of course, and also this narrative of this is the most important election in decades is a way to rally your tribe, right? To say make sure that you go to the voting booth because your life is on the line. But that's something that they argued in 2020 as well. That's something they argued in 2016 as well, 2012 as well, 2008 as well. It's something that they always do to make sure that as many people as possible from their own tribe go to the voting booth.
Absolutely. For transparency and for our listeners, so this episode, as always, comes out basically Wednesday morning, right? Very, very early in the day. That's the moment when the election will be. The polls will just have closed, basically. And I think some of the results will already trickle in. So it might be a funny kind of experience listening to this episode right now because we are talking on Sunday, right? We're talking on November 3rd. And for us, the conversation is a lot more about, well, the system. And I think some of these things that we are discussing now and some of these worries that we have now, you might be experiencing in this very moment, right? So let's say you, the listener, are listening to this on Wednesday, 12, all right, at noon, having maybe already an early lunch. And you're basically listening to this, and at the same time, you're reading on the news, I don't know, Trump doubts the result in Georgia, or, oh, this swing state has not been counted yet. This is almost a paradoxical experience.
In some ways, I should also kind of, once again, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is my thing today, but I need to point out an age difference here between us. Because in most elections, by the time of the European morning when Europe goes to work at 9 o'clock, historically, most elections are already called by then. We already know who's won, typically. It's just that lately elections have been more contested, and this, by the way, started again in 2000, of course, with the hotly contested uh, election of George W. Bush. I given last time, if last time is anything to go by, then it's very unlikely that on Wednesday morning we know for sure who's won. But historically, by 9 o'clock we should know that already. So when people wake up, they should kind of be able to read on the internet in Europe who has won the elections typically.
Yeah, please let us know if you know. That's, because this is right to kind of finish this topic up, because I mean it makes no sense trying to predict this, because we are not experts on it, and there's only a possibility of looking like fools on basically the moment that our listeners are listening to this. One final quick question or a thought I had in the past 2 days about kind of the system in and around elections and the institutions that we're always so concerned about here in the Western bubble framework. In an interview last week, Kamala Harris was asked by an interviewer whether she would pardon Donald Trump if she were to be elected president. So I don't think this is a surprise to anyone that Trump is currently engaged in a few legal battles, and has already been convicted in some. And there was the question of, hey, would you, in order to heal the country, right, in order to maybe also prevent Donald Trump from trying to run again so that he can stay out of prison, would you pardon him? And I mean, Harris answered in a politician's way, I would say. She basically said, well, I don't engage in hypotheticals, which that's funny anyways, right? Because she's always hypothetically talking about what she would do as president, right? On the first day in office, I would be doing this and this. But let's take this question kind of a level higher, away from, oh, should she pardon Trump or not? But do you think, because I haven't made up my mind on this yet, do you think that she should? Because on the one hand, yes, she could potentially heal the country a little bit, right? She could kind of get away from the accusations of a witch hunt, but at the same time, she would also be partly interfering with the courts.
Yeah, no, the answer to me is very clearly no. And I find it disturbing that these questions are being asked of her, and that these conversations exist. There, it is not about politics. It is about whether someone has committed a crime or not. And in a well-functioning democratic liberal system, that requires for the legal processes, the Justice Department, to do their thing without political interference. Pardons have always been very uncomfortable. They exist in most countries. There's something really off about them, but especially in something as political as this. The last thing that you want is the executive, the White House, to basically, for political considerations, give someone a free pass. Basically, the only answer that Harris should have given, rather than ducking the question by saying, hey, I don't deal in hypotheticals, which, as you pointed out, is just silly. The only proper answer was, no, I will let the Justice Department do whatever they do. If they decide that Trump is innocent, then I will fully respect that, and that means that he will be treated as an innocent man. And if it turns out that he's guilty of something, then I also fully respect that. That's it. You want those two branches of government to be separate from each other. And then the argument of, oh yeah, but the country needs healing. I agree, but you can't heal a democratic system by breaking the system from within. And that's what this would have been, or that's what this would be if it happens. It would be the executive branch basically trampling on the division of powers in the United States.
Here I have to be cynical for a minute, because I think that's a very noble and right approach, right? Kind of saying, yeah, of course, right? From our perspective, this can't happen. But what if this means avoiding a situation like in Israel, right? Where, I mean, we have Prime Minister Netanyahu, who only keeps on running to be Prime Minister because that's the only way he can not be trialed for some of the crimes he has committed in the past. Well, or, I mean, to be decided whether he committed any crimes. And now you have the situation where you have an incredibly costly war, right, and actually regional conflict on our hands, mostly because Netanyahu has to stay in power and he cannot lose this coalition that is pushing him further and further into war. He has to kind of make sure that everyone there is happy, because otherwise he might be on trial and he might end up in prison, right? Him personally. Isn't that a scenario we would want to avoid with with Trump and in the United States? And therefore we maybe have to, we like ends have to meet somehow, and we might have to kind of agree that okay, we might have to undermine the system here a little bit to kind of protect it overall.
Well, two thoughts spring to mind here. The two substantial differences between that case and the case of the United States. The case of Israel, first of all, affects other countries. And you could argue, like, there's nothing worse than war. The moment now that we're speaking, people are dying, houses are being destroyed. And you could argue that there is nothing that shouldn't be done to stop that violence. And if this is a way to stop that violence against another country, so be it. But if that were to happen, that would automatically, inherently, undermine the Israeli political system. It would make the Israeli judicial branch much, much weaker towards the future, with all kinds of problems that might entail in the longer term. But yes, there is an argument. If a country is at war and the only way to end that war is to basically pardon people, in this case Netanyahu, all right, you could have that conversation. But that has nothing to do with the strength of the system. It's got to do with ending current human suffering outside of your own borders. You could make a similar case about the truth commissions in South Africa and elsewhere, basically saying, or what happened in Spain after Franco died, that basically the Spanish political establishment said, let's not talk about the past, let's not try to prosecute anyone who may have committed some kind of crimes. We need to look towards the future. It's the only way to save our country. You can make those you can make those decisions, but it's inherently against what a liberal democratic process should look like. The second thought that I have about this is that Israel is not the United States. So already there is plenty of discussion about the democratic values of Israel, of course, because it's not a full democracy. It's a democracy with certain limitations. But even if it were a full democracy, it doesn't have the symbolic importance of the United States. The United States is supposed to be the best democratic system in the world. And so when we undermine US democracy, if the world undermines US democracy, that basically takes everyone down a notch. And pardoning Trump would absolutely undermine US democracy. So I think the stakes in the US domestic sphere are higher than the stakes for Israel domestically, because Israel doesn't have this role model function that the United States has.
But isn't that exactly the argument to do it? Because Trump continuing to engage in the political process in the United States only further harms the US system. And therefore, anything should be done to kind of sideline him. And a quick pardon, right? And obviously, I'm framing this right with a quick pardon, could be an easy solution to an otherwise very lengthy process. Because I mean, what if Trump doesn't, right? So let's say he loses. And then he basically spends the next 2 years claiming that this election was stolen and undermined the system and kind of hurting the system further, right? When we've seen this already with kind of an attempt to kind of exchange election officials, right? The ones who are certifying the counts, the ones who are counting, right? There's a very organized process by the forces, right? Kind of, following Trump, to undermine the democratic process and the democratic institutions. And so with this, right, you sometimes maybe have to, you just have to swallow that pill in order to kind of protect the overall system.
So this is a really good example of where there is ambiguity, in the sense that what you just said, I could counter with saying, yeah, but by giving him a pardon, what you would do is you would encourage others to do similar things in the future, knowing that they could get a pardon as well, thereby further undermining the system. So this is an ambiguous conversation. It's not clear what the truth is here. It's certainly not in the short term. And in those cases, I have found that it's best to go back to foundational principles. If it's not completely obvious, if we could, if by pardoning Trump we could save 1 million children tomorrow, then I would say, okay, just pardon Trump and we'll deal with the with the results later. We can save 1 million children, but that's not the case here. It's not completely obvious what the long-term impact will be of pardoning him, if that comes up as a scenario, because the other scenario is that he pardons himself because he wins the elections. Um, the In a case where it's ambiguous, what you want to do is say, okay, we can't come to some very clear consensus. So let's go back to the foundational principles of our system. What are the foundational principles of our system? The branches of government should be separate and even competitive in some ways, and they should not be one should not dominate the other one. There should be this tension where the executive branch might politically find it very convenient to pardon him, but they can't or they shouldn't because the judicial branch is independent and has to do its own thing. So just go back to Principles 101, and that's often in these cases the best solution.
Yeah, going back to Principles 101, I like that. Um, let's move on to the foreign policy perspective of all of this, right? Because, I mean, the Western Bubble podcast, we're very much focused on foreign policy. And we can't predict who wins, but we can already kind of see how foreign policy might change with each of the candidates. I would say we start with Harris, because the foreign policy of Harris is basically going to be a continuation of the foreign policy of Biden, with a varying stance on Israel potentially. So it will be more of Biden, and with this also more of the Western bubble.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I have difficulty explaining to people, because when people say, "Oh, what a disaster it would be if Trump wins," my answer to that is yes. Intuitively, I've got a very, very, deep dislike for the man, and I would be very fearful of his volatile behavior. Having said that, US foreign policy over the past decades has been disastrous, has been really, really bad. And Harris would be a continuation of that really, really bad foreign policy. With Trump, it could go either way, and it's not all that obvious, right? With Harris, you know what you're gonna get, more or less. With small, as you said, small differences on Israel, relatively. It's not as if the United States all of a sudden is going to withdraw support for Israel, but they might be more critical. They might withhold some weapon systems or some financial support or something like that if Netanyahu continues doing what he does. But the differences aren't going to be major. However, with Trump, it could go either way. And his presidency between 2017 and 2021 was actually not all that bad. There were some moments that were bad because Trump is volatile. He doesn't. He functions based on his own narcissism, and I say that as not being a psychiatrist or psychologist who can diagnose him, but just from an intuitive narcissistic perspective, it seems that he behaves based on whatever suits him on the day. He doesn't follow a clear ideology. I always feel that people who call him a fascist give him way too much intellectual credit. He's not anything. He doesn't know what he is. He just follows his own agenda that suits him. But that also leads to him, for example, not getting involved in really badly thought out, very badly designed foreign policy adventures, right? And that means that in some ways, from a world's perspective, the Trump presidency might actually be less problematic than a Harris presidency.
We've analyzed Donald Trump's foreign policy between 2017 and 2021 in the past, and it was mostly very volatile and behavior, very much based on his business mindset. If I strike a deal with you, and this is what you get in exchange, and please do this, otherwise that will come for you. So in that sense, it's definitely not so much the bubble policy, the Western bubble policy, right? Because all these elements of human rights, democracy are missing. Right, there is still very much this element of we are the United States and we are going to squash you if you don't do what we tell you to do. Right, so that in that sense there's still some of those bubble elements there, But I agree that overall, from a Western bubble perspective, Kamala Harris would be very much a continuation of what we criticize, and Donald Trump would be a coin toss. On the problems on every single topic, right?
And every single day.
Yeah, it might go this way, it might go this way, but yeah, it's on every single topic, every single day. It's a new coin toss, basically going left, right, and center.
Absolutely, and that could lead to very scary scenarios. So it's not as if that would automatically be preferable. It depends how the coin falls down, right? What direction he chooses to take. So it is in some ways more dangerous, but it doesn't have to be as destructive as general U.S. foreign policy. And if you look, I think when we talked about that in that other episode, two very clear examples of when things went wrong was when he killed Soleimani, the Iranian general in Baghdad, who was visiting Iraq. That was a very bad and destructive move. And when he withdrew from the Kurds, when he withdrew support from the Kurds, and he basically let Erdogan and Turkey basically drive into Syria, creating very significant long-term geopolitical problems for the United States and, of course, for the region. So it's not as if everything was brilliant. There were some really, really bad moments in the U.S. Foreign policy under Trump, but he didn't start any new wars. He didn't start any large conflicts, unlike his predecessors, unlike what Biden is trying to do with the Cold War towards China. So in that sense, I am very much on the fence from a foreign policy perspective. Now, before someone clips this in an incorrect way, I also already pointed out that intuitively, as a human being, of course, I much prefer Harris to Trump. I find it very difficult to understand. I would like to understand it better, but I find it very difficult to understand why anyone could vote for Donald Trump just as a, just from a human perspective, the kind of man he is. And domestically, it is very clear that Trump is a real danger to U.S. democracy. There's no doubt about that. It weakens the system further. If he becomes president, he will do everything he can to avoid accountability. He will weaken the systems that so far have opposed him, and that's bad for the United States. But hey, our bubble's about international relations, and from a foreign policy perspective, it's more ambiguous.
So this is not a clear Western bubble endorsement, right? It's not that we are proud to announce that the Western bubble endorses a candidate for the US election.
One should never endorse candidates, I would argue, right? This is an interesting issue that the newspapers always face. And I think endorsing candidates never made sense from a media perspective. But certainly, what do our listeners care about if I say, oh, people should vote for Harris or people should vote for Trump? That is not the value that we add to these kinds of conversations. I could personally never vote for Trump, and I could personally reluctantly vote for Harris, as kind of the lesser of two evils, so to say. But that's about it, and that should not be particularly relevant to anyone listening to me.
I was about to say, I mean, what do two Europeans, right, have to say about this topic? I would also like to see an American, right, who is like, oh yeah, let's have two European dudes tell me what to vote for. Isn't that what the whole project of the United States would be about?
But even with newspapers or other media outlets, it always seems very uncomfortable. So the New York Times or the Washington Post suggesting or endorsing a candidate, to me, feels like a surrender of your journalistic responsibilities. You're not here to judge one candidate versus the other candidate. You're here to analyze them.
So are you supporting that Jeff Bezos basically forced the Washington Post editorial board to not publish their endorsement of Kamala Harris?
Well, I mean, he denies that he forced it, right? Just from a legal perspective, before we got sued by one of the richest men on the planet, he denies that he forced the editorial board to do that. So this is very clearly a case of, theoretically, he's got a point. Namely, I think, just like I just said, it makes sense for an editorial board not to endorse candidates, and I don't understand why the tradition has been so long-lasting in terms of newspapers all around the world doing this. It's bad journalism. It's bad editorial behavior.
That's an American thing, right?
British as well. In Britain, they do it as well.
Anglo-Saxon thing.
Anglo-Saxon thing, yeah. And I think other countries have started copying that slowly over time. Thinking that newspapers need to take that position. I think it's bad journalism. So in that sense, I'm with Bezos. Having said that, of course, the timing of doing this is just ridiculously bad and should never have happened in this way, because obviously the message, despite his denials, the message to everyone else is, here's a billionaire who has business interests, and he doesn't want those business interests to be hurt by his media outlet, which is not a reason why billionaires shouldn't own newspapers. You just don't want newspapers to be owned by the rich and powerful because there's too many contrasting, conflicting interests.
Absolutely. No, it's. I mean, in general, right? Endorsing someone for me is an interesting concept because, as I think you said very well, I personally have preferences, right? I think I personally, if I had to vote, I think it wouldn't be very difficult for me. Let's just say that.
I've seen the poster of Donald Trump on your wall, Dario. I know.
Exactly, it's right behind me. All right, I've said this many times that I would love for Donald Trump to become the Prime Minister of the United States because that position doesn't exist. I think it would solve a lot of problems, but most importantly, it would keep my entertainment. Right, I've been so entertained by him, and this is a whole part that we haven't really delved in.
This is again the difference between us. I don't find it entertaining. I just find it so unpleasant and off-putting.
It's no for me. I mean, there's a game I've been playing for the last 2 weeks, and that's is this AI or real life, right? Is this a picture generated by AI, right? Trump at McDonald's, or Trump with a garbage truck, or him doing sexual activities to a microphone, right? Like all of these things, I have to look at them 3, 4 times and actually fact check: is this real or is this some Russian troll who's trying to trick me? But as a whole, yeah, I'm not sure whether that would be a good candidate, right? But let's make him prime minister. It would solve all the problems. But back to the part about endorsements. This is very concerning. Exactly, right? It's first of all that newspapers feel the need to engage in this, right, in endorsing others, but at the same time, a billionaire with very clear business interests owning that newspaper, and then for some reason his editorial board claiming that they wanted to publish this and they were not allowed to, right? So that's all the circumstantial evidence I'm going to put here on the table, or everything that has been said, and the listeners can make their can build and form their own opinion about this. But it's really concerning.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. And then this could have been avoided. I don't think anyone would have had a problem if in December this year, after the elections, after them endorsing, which would very likely have been Harris, after endorsing Harris in December, the Washington Post posted an editorial saying, "Hey, we've done this one more time, but we thought about this. We don't know who's going to run 4 years down the line. We don't know what's going to be the political situation in the United States in 2028. However, we have decided from this moment on never to endorse candidates anymore because we feel it doesn't really fit our perspective on what journalism should be like." If the Washington Post had done that 4 years in advance, nobody would have thought any of that, and we would have congratulated them on that decision. It would have made a lot of sense. But now with this timing, and we know the business interests that exist, of course it's very ugly, and it sheds a light on the enormous power that people like Bezos, but also very obviously Musk and others, Gates, have on the US political system, and how scary that is for a world that is based on democratic liberal values where everyone is supposedly equal.
So now that we're talking about the media and the role of the media in our system, and we already mentioned the United Kingdom, right, as part of this Anglo-Saxon triangle of endorsements. There was a newspaper article, or basically a news item, that caught my attention a few days ago. It caught me a little bit by surprise, and it was Ofcom, which is apparently the Office of Communications in the United Kingdom. And I want to read to you the first sentence that basically Google tells me, right, about with their own website. Also for the listeners who want to know what the Office of Communications, aka Ofcom, does. Ofcom is the regulator for the communication services that we use and rely on each day. Huh? Isn't that a nice little description of themselves? Um, so this Ofcom situation or organization, they find a British news outlet, GB News, and they find them £1,000, right? And this ruling isn't final yet because it's being contested in the courts, but they find them for basically providing former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak a mostly uncontested platform to promote his policies ahead of the election. And that caught me by surprise because who is this agency, which apparently is a public agency, and why are they basically telling broadcasters what they can say and what they can't say?
What's interesting is that this is a reflection of two different worlds that we live in, because it surprises me that you're surprised by that, because Ofcom, as well as the FCC in the United States, which is the American equivalent of the British agency, are very common household names in terms of media regulation for me. So the fact that you had never heard of this and that the concept to you seems alien is very interesting to me. The argument in favor of an organization like this, but it's not a clear cut case, is that there is a gray area between things being illegal, in which case you just go to court, you go through the legal processes, and things potentially being destructive in terms of media behavior. And so you have these agencies to make sure that even if the media stays within the bounds of legality, they still behave in a way that serves the general public. That's basically the idea. Now, that is not, an open and shut case, because it's completely up for debate what that actually means. What is the public interest? What is the legitimacy here? Could it be dangerous to free speech? And all those kinds of conversations, right? But the fact that you had never heard of this and that you never thought about this means that in Germany apparently things are different.
And I'm not 100% certain on this. And a quick Google research couldn't help me. So in case there's any smart German listeners who want to tell us about this, please write us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com. Because here we have the Bundesnetzagentur and other organizations that basically they will slap the media on the fingers if they kind of report facts in a clearly misleading way, or yeah, but that's basically it. That's the only thing that's the only example I can think about of where I heard basically the media being told off by someone in Germany. So I was very surprised, particularly given that it's a public agency, right? So it's government run, and that to me was very concerning, because I thought, oh, what about this, right? I mean, what about the fourth pillar of democracy, as they like to call themselves? Don't they need to be separated from the other powers?
So, but what you're describing about the German situation is basically a more limited version of the British and American systems. And I think once you go down that rabbit hole, it is very unclear where you would draw the line, right? So if the German regulators argue that a news outlet has misstated facts, okay, based on what? What are facts? How do you go about that? You already start entering a gray zone, and it seems then that Ofcom and the FCC just go a little bit further in what they are allowed to do in that sense. But the process is relatively similar. What you get with the FCC in the United States, famously or infamously, is that there's a sort of prudish nature to it. For example, they get very upset when you show genitalia or when you say certain words on TV that might be legal to say, but might be seen as offensive to the general US public. British Ofcom is more interested in political, what they call neutrality, or political objective reporting. And that was this case that was brought that you read about. It was very much about whether GB News had actually basically become a propaganda platform, a little bit like what Fox News is in the United States for the right, whether JB News had done the same for the Rishi Sunak days, that basically Sunak as prime minister got a free pass when he shouldn't have gotten a free pass.
And this is all in accordance with British law, which is why, hey, who am I to tell the Brits how to govern their country? They're no longer in the European Union, so I can't. But sorry, I'm so sorry, my British friends. But
this is exactly why they left there. You had to get rid of German oppression. Yeah.
It's absolutely. But another problem I have with this is so this agency kind of decides what's critical enough and what's not. And that's, I mean, right, the government saying, hey, this is too critical or this is not critical enough, right? I mean, okay, it's not the government, right? It's the overall legislative body, and there's probably many levels of bureaucrats between Rishi Sunak and the rest. But I mean, who defines what, for an example, is critical and not critical enough?
And that's exactly that very gray area, but that also exists when it comes to facts, right? What you said about the Germans. So there is a very clear slippery slope, a real problem when an agency has a certain political bias itself, has a certain understanding of the world, and then emphasizes some things and ignores other things. That becomes very, very problematic. For example, what you very clearly see in mainstream media is that there is this sense that they are the bastion against extreme right wing thoughts. Now you've got GB News stepping outside of that media establishment and going down the path of extreme right wing ideology, and now Ofcom lashes out against that. There is a real danger there that it becomes basically about suppressing anyone who speaks differently than what is supposedly acceptable by society. That's a dangerous path, and I think there's an argument that an organization like Ofcom should not go down that path and should not make that decision. Having said that, um, if you don't regulate it at all, the danger is that society just gets pulled into the direction of the Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, who control media and who can just basically manipulate everything to their will. So, as a public organization, you could argue that having a guardian on behalf of the state, on behalf of the general public, helps defend against the powers that be, it helps defend against the billionaire class, it helps defend against multinationals.
Again, I think the main reason why I'm confused and concerned about this is because something like this, I'm sure, pretty sure, right? I would say 80-90% sure it doesn't exist in Germany from the government. I know this exists on on a voluntary level, where basically all the media outlets kind of came together and said, okay, we're going to create this council, and I assume they sent representatives there, and they came up with a codex, right? Like basically a codex of the print media. And this is the one they're following, right? So it's kind of like a self-regulation by the whole media landscape in Germany, right? I mean, I assume organizations can decide not to be part of this, but that's basically what I thought was usually the case, right? So this is kind of self-organized, and it's the best journalists that we have, once they're retired, we'll send them off to this council, and then they kind of whack their fingers at the younger generation when they maybe were factually not as accurate as before, right?
Yeah.
That's the extent to which I thought, okay, that's healthy.
Yeah, and there is another additional issue here, right? Because what it forces an organization like Ofcom to essentially treat political parties as equal. And basically, because that's the main complaint here, right? It's the main complaint behind Ofcom's report. And the fine, I think they had to pay £100,000, if I'm correct, is you you dealt with one party in a very positive way, and you didn't deal with the issues in a way that represents the whole political spectrum. So what that does then, it forces media outlets by Ofcom to go to the middle of the political debate. But very often the middle of the political debate is not the right place to be for journalists. Sometimes for journalists, they need to take a very clear stance because the journalistic truth, lies in one direction, right? It is simply incorrect to automatically assume that a journalist's job is to be right in the center of politics. A journalist's job is to understand the truth and hold power to account, to critically assess what's happening in society. And sometimes that should take you into a sort of more radical extremist direction. And in that case, it's dangerous if Ofcom pulls you back and pulls you back to the center.
That's right. So that's basically what's happening in the UK. Are there any other special news in the United Kingdom? One of our favorite case studies in the Western Bubble podcast that we need to care about.
Oh, you know what you're asking about. We've got the Tories, who just elected a new great leader. They've already been incredibly successful over the past decade, starting with Cameron and then Theresa May, Boris Johnson, then the brilliant Liz Truss, then Rishi Sunak, and now we are with Kemi Badenoch as the new Tory leader, the Conservative leader. What's to say about it? She is, according to all basic standards, she is very much to the right of the political spectrum, arguably extreme right. It's a reaction to Nigel Farage's party. It's a reaction to trying to still cover the right-wing voters, believing that the Tories can also still win the centre voters. The problem with this is that, of course, it's not going to work. A party like the Tories cannot go more and more extreme right wing and think that they can win that political fight. It's just not going to happen.
No, I don't know.
No, because they will always be out radicalized by Farage, and it will only allow center parties like the Lib Dems or Labour. Labour is also a center party nowadays. You can't really call them left wing anymore. To basically occupy that middle ground. It's also a situation where, once again, politicians are looking at political expediency, a little bit like pardoning Trump, like that question, looking at, hey, is this politically convenient, rather than sticking with principles. A political party like the Conservatives in the UK have certain principles that they seem to have. They had certain principles that have been thrown overboard, that have basically been shed. And the party now in 2024 has nothing to do with the party 50 years ago or 40 years ago, 30 years ago. It's a completely new beast nowadays. Very much about radical policy rather than conservative values, as like One Nation, Tories, and that kind of thing. So basically, it's a political party that has forgotten its principles and that is misjudging the political environment.
Well, as we established in this episode so far, I'm in it for the chaos, or no, not so much the chaos, but little observations that are very telling about humanity as a whole. The biggest like kind of thing for me in this right vote for the new Tory leadership was the results. Right, and that there were basically 131,680 people who were eligible to vote. Of them, 72% voted, which I thought was surprisingly little. You know, you're in a party, meaning you're very committed, so you might as well vote. But then there were about 655 rejected ballots, and 45 of them basically were marked twice. So people voted for two candidates. And my question here is, what happened? So if any of our listeners have a theory or know someone who maybe voted twice, I really would like to know what drives people to vote twice, or whether this is just 45 out of 131,000 people who basically, I don't know, lost their glasses and accidentally marked it twice.
Ever since democracy has existed, all the way back to Plato and philosopher kings, there has been this conversation about, should we have some kind of intelligence test or competency test for people to be allowed to vote. Now, the answer to that is no, because what kind of test would that be, and how do you set the criteria? And that would already have inherent bias into the system, so that would not work. But, you know, it's very obvious that voters are not always the most informed and the most competent in these kinds of things. And that's the big problem with democracy, right? You're basically allowing millions and millions of voters, that by the way includes you and me, I mean, who do not have sufficient information, who do not have inside information, who do not necessarily have the necessary intelligence to make an informed decision. You allow us to choose candidates, and that is a real problem for democracy. It leads to uninformed decisions, and that can very quickly lead to really bad political leadership. And that might, in fact, in the longer term, be the death of democracy.
I mean, if I was tasked to design a test, I would just have one question on it, and it would say, basically, please mark only one of the following options. And then I would give three options, and whoever marks one option gets to vote. It's right. That would be my genius test, kind of designed to make sure that democracy works.
But it leads to an interesting conversations about what kind of competence is required, right? Because there's, I don't know, Mensa, that organization of the 2% of the highest IQ people. I mean, if you join Mensa, that means that you're not particularly intelligent, because IQ is only a relatively small part of what we understand to be intelligence. And if you believe that you need to join a group based on one criterion, on one test, one IQ test, and that somehow makes you, be among other intelligent people, then that actually shows the opposite. The same could be said about any test, right? Tests are inherently biased towards certain groups. We know that IQ tests are more favorable to people who grew up in a certain educational system. Nothing to do with genetics, nothing to do with culture itself, but it's got to do with how you are taught to think in a certain way. And IQ tests cater to that. That's why you often see IQ tests being particularly kind to white middle-aged men, rather than, for example, immigrants who do not have that educational background, but might be much more intelligent in every other way. So basically, democracy fails quickly if voters are not somehow humble in what they do. And what we see, because of the internet, because of the 21st century, voters have become much less humble, become much more aggressive, and that leads to radicalization of society, and it leads to an outcome such as a potential new Trump presidency. It leads to an outcome of the Tory party essentially being absorbed by radical extremism, and reasonable long-term policy making suffers.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western Bubble. That is it from my side. Boulder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
Well, I was told by you that I needed to use a slightly more optimistic quote, a slightly more productive quote that didn't just moan about voters and their idiocy. So I've got a quote by Indira Gandhi, obviously famous Prime Minister of India, who said, "Winning or losing of the election is less important than strengthening the country."